Right, let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the webinar series organized by Bartlett Religare Securities. Our theme for today's webinar is tapping the potential of plantations through sustainable initiatives. So during next 1 to 1.5 hours, we plan to discuss about the challenges, the outlook, and measures to improve the future potential of the local plantation industry. Now, we intend to open the forum for question and answers towards the latter part of the webinar. So please send in your questions through the chat window for our panelists. So now let me introduce our panel. So today we are joined by a very eminent panel who have years of industry experience behind them. First, let me welcome Mr. Dr. Roshan Rajdure. He is the Managing Director of Haley's Plantation Sector and has 37 years of experience in the industry. Kalani Valley Plantation, Talawakale, and Horana Plantations come under his purview. He was the chairman of the Planters Association of Ceylon, a board member of the Sri Lanka Tea Board, Tea Research Institute, Rubber Research Board, Tea Smallholding Development Authority, and the Tea Council of Sri Lanka. He serves in the Standing Committee of Agriculture of the University Grants Commission. He holds a BSc Honours in Plantation Management, an MBA from the Postgraduate Institute of Agriculture, Peradeniya, and an MSc in Plantation, Crop and Agriculture, and a DSc from Wimber University, and a PhD in Management. So next, let me warmly welcome Mr. Binesh Pananwala. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Watawala Plantation PLC and Watawala Dairy Limited. He has 28 years of experience in the plantation sector. Currently, he is the Chairman of Plantation Services, the Employers Federation of Ceylon, Vice Chairman of All Island Dairy Association, a member of the Executive Committee of the Palm Oil Industry Association, a member of the Sri Lanka Institute of Directors, a member of the Plantation Management Committee of the Planters Association of Ceylon. He holds an MSc in Crop Science from the University of Peradeniya and also has an MBA from the Manipal University. So thank you very much, Dr. Rajdure and Mr. Pananwala for joining us today. Now, how we are going to do today's webinar is, we are going to have a panel discussion and followed by a Q&A session. So before we start with the panel discussion, let me share a brief presentation with you, which I think will set the tone for the webinar. Right. So in the first slide, you can see the contribution from the plantation sector to the national economy. So altogether, nearly 475,000 hectares under cultivation and approximately 2.8 million employment in the sector. And out of the three sectors, tea is the biggest contributor, nearly 200,000 hectares and almost 2.2 million employment. In the tea segment, it's mainly dominated by the tea smallholders, nearly 63% of the land and 62% of the production. And RPCs contribute about 36% of the production. The rubber sector, about 136,000 hectares and nearly 600,000 employment, again dominated by regional smallholders to the tune of about 65%. Then the palm oil sector, nearly 10,000 hectares and about 13,000 employment. So in the next slide, we can see the evolution of the plantation industry profits during the last 8 quarters. So the red bars, it shows the years, the quarters, the industry made losses, and the green bars show the profitable quarters. So you can see the whole of financial year 2020 and the quarter before that, the sector made consecutive losses between 500 million to 1 billion. So there are a few reasons. First, now the wage increase came, and secondly, the inclement weather conditions that impact the production, and also prices were also impacted due to increasing global supply. But fast forward now this year, during the first half, we have seen the tide turning, especially with the COVID situation giving a much needed breather to the industry. So we saw the tea prices surging due to perceived benefits of consuming black tea in the pandemic situation. And also due to increasing demand for PPE, we saw the rubber prices also inching up. And also the palm oil industry benefited due to the excess demand situation. So during first quarter of this year, the industry made about 1.7 billion profits, and the second quarter made nearly 930 million profits. Now this is the aggregate of the listed plantation stocks profitability during the period. In the next slide, we can see the valuation of the listed plantation stocks. Now, if you look at historically, the sector had always been trading below the broader market due to inherent industry risk. Now, most of them are beyond the control of the plantation companies. The cyclicality of the business, the climate change leading to inclement weather conditions and that disrupting the output, and also the arbitrary government policies. Now, the most recent example we can think of is the ban of glyphosate, and also high labor costs, low productivity. So all of these are impacting the predictability of the earnings in the industry. Now, in the next slide, now I'm going back to the history of the industry. So nationalization of estates. Now, all company-owned estates were nationalized in 1975. So you can see the ownership before the nationalization. So the British-owned companies owned by 26%, and the Ceylonese companies owned about 25%, and Ceylonese individual 25%. These smallholders about 18%. So after nationalization, Janata Estate Development Board and Sri Lanka State Plantation Corporation managed these estates after the nationalization. Now, next slide is quite interesting. So in the next slide, we can see the performance under state management. Now, from 1972 to 1992, for a period of 20 years under state management, the producer sector incurred losses for 13 years. You can see now during this period, the span of 20-year period, only during 7 years only the sector made profits. Now, this is also due to external reasons. Now, if you look at here from 1977, 1979 period, now this is due to rupee devaluation by nearly 44%. And in 1983, 1984, now this is due to the ban on Indian tea exports due to the elections there. And again, 1989 to 1990, again, rupee devaluation. So now this is despite having a very favorable input costs during that time, and all due to the mismanagement of the state sector. So this situation led the government to privatize the plantations. So now with that, Dr. Rajadurai, I'd like to take an entrance to the panel discussion from here. So will you be able to share with us briefly about the history and the background of the 1992 privatization and how the industry fared pre and post privatization in terms of, say, output, productivity, global market share, and profitability?
Thank you, Vajrapani, and good evening to everybody who's joining into this webinar. So I'll take off from where you stopped. Up to the period of 1992. In 1992, the estates were privatized, the official reports like the Presidential Commission by Dr. Kalagama all say one thing, that the estates were making losses to the tune at that time from the records available. We find that almost 2.3 billion was a loss in 1991. Further, they had a debt of about 3 billion. And on top of that, the government had to subsidize for operational costs almost 5 billion rupees. So under these conditions, it was imperative and it was required that the government shed off this burden, because the total subsidy was equal to the value of the total food import bill of the country at that time. I'm talking the 1990s. So the government initially broke up these estates into 20 RP, regional plantation companies, fully owned by the government. And then they allowed reputed companies to be managing agents. So the government pumped in a certain amount of money, but there were private entities managing it, which was not a very successful system. And in 1995, government gave the option of purchasing the majority shares in these companies and going in for full privatization. So that's basically how the regional plantation companies got into the management. And quite contrary to popular belief, people think that they got it free. At the time of privatization in 1995, it was all or nothing. 51% of the companies bought shares at par value. Some, of course, went higher than that. According to our records at that time, in 1995, the companies paid almost 8 billion rupees in terms of share value. Thereafter, of course, it was traded on the stock exchange prices at a higher price. So this is what the companies paid at that time to purchase the managed or to be in charge of the management of the estates. Thereafter, we have paid up to about last year lease rental of over 10 billion rupees. So you have to calculate the current value and see the total amount of money you have paid. So that's a start. So initially, in the first few years of privatization, with less government intervention, the RPCs were managed reasonably well. And when you say regional plantation companies, people think only of tea. Rubber and other crops is also an important component of this game. And first 5 years, 10 years, almost up to about 2002, the estates were managed sort of under private management with less government intervention. Thereafter, unfortunately, maybe because of conditions and externalities beyond our control, the government intervened in wage setting. So then from there, it went all downhill. If you look at the numbers, you can see from 2002, the wage increases mandated or mostly coerced by government pressure were not in keeping with the price increase. Very, very briefly, if I were to encapsulate what I'm saying, during the management of state plantation over the 12-year period, if you take the average wage and if you take the average value of a kilo of tea at the auction, if the kilo of tea at the auction was, say, 100 rupees, for example, the labor wage was only 67 rupees. The value of a labor day was 67% of the value of a kilo of tea. Fast forward that to privatization period, if you take all 25 years period as a whole, now the value of a labor wage is almost double, 150 rupees. So this is the challenge that we are facing in terms of private sector management. One thing, the tea and rubber prices have not risen as fast as the rise in labor wage. On the other hand, we can say we have given very high labor wage increases, not in keeping with the market reality. So this is the dilemma that we are faced with. And Sri Lanka being a developing country, people have high expectations. Our per capita income is higher than other countries. And in the tea economies, still Sri Lanka pays the highest daily labor wage. Even today, if you compare India, they pay 175 Indian rupees for almost 34 kilos of minimum output. Whereas in Sri Lanka, we pay 855 rupees and our output maximum is about 18 to 20 kilos. The downside is even if they bring 12 kilos, you have to pay the full day's wages, and we are mandated to offer 300 days wages, and particularly in an agricultural enterprise where your dependency on climate, weather and other externalities are very high. This is not a very good system, because when the people know there are compulsory work that has to be offered, it precludes productivity and profitability. So that is basically the situation that we are in. So, but what I must say is, since privatization, since the private sector management has come in, number one is that we have taken the burden of the government of subsidizing the plantation sector, meaning the treasury doesn't have to dole out money, and that money was very profitably and very wisely used to uphold the smallholder sector of Sri Lanka, and they have made significant progress because they didn't have to subsidize the regional plantation companies. Number two, we have developed our estates because a lot has changed in the industry in terms of new clearing. There's another misconception: the regional plantation companies have not planted adequately. Actually, when you took over, we had only 17% of vegetatively propagated tea. We took over 17%, but today we have got up to 56% the vegetatively propagated tea. I'm only talking about tea. And what about rubber? We have planted almost 72,000 hectares of new rubber over the span of 25 or 26 years. Then we have planted oil palm, almost 20,000 hectares of forestry, cinnamon and other crops. So RPC is not only doing tea planting, we have a multifaceted portfolio in terms of tea, rubber, some coconut, oil palm, export crops like cinnamon, fuel wood, forestry. So we have done extensive replanting. And then, as you can see, the capital development, in terms of capital development, we have spent almost 55 rupees in the fields, in the factories, in infrastructure, in human capital development. So the important thing that I want to highlight is that the regional plantation sector is managing their affairs on their own without being a burden to the government nor to the people of the country. And if the stakeholders concerned permit us to manage this industry as a business unit rather than it being a political, how shall I say, political, I don't get that, political tool, then we can manage the plantation sector quite profitably and viably. So our contention here is that industry must make its own decisions regarding the conduct of the business, particularly in terms of labor wages, depending on the market forces, and in terms of how we are going to sell our product outside. So those are the important matters that we need to take a firm decision on in going forward. There's a lot of potential in our industry because we have managed, in spite of the disadvantages that we have compared to the other competing countries, because their labor wages are low comparatively, their productivity is high, individual productivity is high, and there's an oversupply of tea in the world market, and still about 50% of our tea is going as a commodity, even after 100 years of the tea industry. So these are the areas that we need to carefully look at and attend and sort of give solutions so that our industry, as you mentioned, almost 1 million, 2 million people are somehow or other involved in the industry, because in the smallholder sector, in tea alone, there are 440,000 operators. And in regional plantation companies, we host almost 1 million people. So almost 2 million people in tea alone, forgetting the rubber and coconut cultivations. So it's an important segment in the industry, and people often forget that in the tea plantation areas, whether it's tea or rubber, local communities, local bazaars, townships are entirely dependent. Their economy is dependent on the viability, profitability, and the sustenance of the tea plantation economy in that area. So any diminution of the tea plantation economy in those local areas will have a direct impact on not only the plantation people itself, but on the local community as well, which we cannot quantify and measure. So that is the opening remarks that I wish to say. And we in the regional plantation company sector are quite confident. And if you are given the leeway, the width to manage the industry as a modern, profitable business, that definitely we can turn into very good performance. Now, this year, because of the COVID and because of the fact, it's a fact that tea is beneficial and it has antiviral and antioxidant properties that are helpful to invigorate your health and resist this virus. There is a reasonable demand. Maybe other countries, the supply chains are not as well organized as in Sri Lanka. I think all credit must be given to every stakeholder involved. We quickly got onto the electronic auctions and supply chains were restored, packing started and shipping started. Our tea industry and to a degree rubber industry quickly got on their feet and we established our normalcy, even in the plantations, right up to the shipping. And that gave us a head start in terms of positioning ourselves in the market. And that has helped us in getting a little higher prices than last year, but nowhere near, unfortunately, 2017. So I'm open to questions because it's a very wide subject. So during the Q&A session, I'll be able to highlight some more. I hope
Sure.
that suffices to give a very brief introduction.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rajathore. So next, I'd like to move to Mr. Pananwala for his opening remarks about the industry.
Good evening. Thank you, Vajrapani. I think good evening to all of you, all those who have joined the webinar today. Indeed, actually, kind of I really want to touch upon on the palm oil segment, which is like, could say that it's a new kid on the block, and that's how it has been pronounced in the local industry. So I have a presentation which I will hope my presentation is clear. To move on, actually, though it's the new crop that we pronounce that all the time, that it says the palm oil is a new crop which is on in Sri Lanka. The other side of it is that it had completed 50 years as of last previous year. So it's no more a new crop, and also that it had come to Sri Lanka to kind of in terms of like, not in the same manner that it had gone to Malaysia or Indonesia. So I would like to put on it. So basically the kind of, I thought that I'll give a kind of a in-depth to the palm oil industry in the world. Though the palm oil industry or the oil palm plant is coming from West Africa, now it has moved to the kind of through the equator, it has gone to Indonesia and Malaysia. So in 1848, it had been moved to botanical gardens in Indonesia and then also to Singapore in 1870. So it had been in quite a long period in these two countries. Actually, the Indonesia and Malaysia contributes about 85% of the palm oil production. That 85% is basically covered almost 13.5 million hectares of palm oil, oil palm land in these both countries.
Mr. Pananwala, just to interrupt, we are still in the first slide.
Oh, sorry. Has it moved now?
Not yet.
Oops. Let me upload it again.
Sure.
Is it okay, Vajrapani? I'm sorry.
Still, I cannot see. Shall we try sharing it from our end?
Yeah, until that time, I'll just go on the kind of
Sure.
presentation. So, so basically, the kind of in the world segment, like, the 35%. Is it shared, Vajrapani?
Yes, it's being shared. Raghav, can we move to slide number 3? Yeah, evolution of
Thank
the evolution of the oil palm industry. Right? Slide number 3.
Yeah, the previous slide. Okay. So, so as I mentioned, like, the palm oil is like, if you look at the Malaysian the GDP, the contribution to the Malaysian GDP is about 2.8% is coming from palm oil industry, which is equivalent to about 38 billion ringgit. So that's a contribution the palm oil industry makes to these economies. In terms of the 85%, once you break down, it says like almost 50% is come from Indonesia and the balance 34% is from Malaysia. And the main importers of the palm oil is basically the India, which is about 15% of the total production, and Indonesia consume, and also the China. So these are the countries which are importing palm oil from both countries, which produce a larger volumes of palm oil. We can move to the next slide. Just to give why the palm oil industry is so vibrant and why it contributes to the GDP so much is mainly because of the kind of the properties that the palm oil has. So if you look at the world oil production, out of it 38.7% is produced is palm oil, where the rest is that basically rapeseed oil, sunflower oil and other oil. But the land utilization is around 6.6% of the total extent which is utilized for production of oil. And also the other thing is that most important factor is that per hectare, the oil production is about 3.8 tons per hectare when it comes to palm oil, whereas the others, including the coconut, is only about 800 liters per hectare. So that's the equation. So in the event that any of the other oil has to produce the equivalent to that 38.7%, it has to have 4 times of the land, which is not that 6.6%. The 4 times of the land, which is almost about 25% of the land is used, required to produce the same amount of oil. So that's a property which you can see in palm oil. We'll move to the other. So in the Sri Lankan context, I would say that, that as I mentioned that since 1968 that oil palm is being planted in the country. And also it started with a small block in Nakadenia, and then the mill was commenced in 1988. So it had done about almost about 40 years now. The mill is in functioning. It had gone to different levels. And then the kind of other value addition forms have come in the palm oil industry in the Sri Lankan context. Whereas like at the initial stage of setting up of the mill, it was only the crude palm oil was done. Then since late that we see kernel palm oil and other products from the palm is also in the market. We'll move to the next slide. So the all here issue is around the kind of areas where the palm oil is oil palm is planted. So we have about 10,000 hectares, and about 7 regional plantation companies have gone into cultivation of oil palm. And whereas in the country there are 2 crude palm oil mills, which is one is the AN and other one is Watawala. So when it takes to the extent, the larger extent comes from Watawala, and then the rest is followed by Namanukula and Alpitia, and others have a smaller extents. So I would like to say that that in the context of the Sri Lankan cultivation, that the Sri Lankan government in 2014 it was decided to plant 20,000 hectares in order to be self-sufficient in the Sri Lankan oil production. So I'll move to the next slide. So I think these are very important area where I think most perceive that Sri Lanka is kind of a self-sufficient in production of oil, but it is not so. So our requirement is about 300,000 metric tons per year. out of which the Sri Lanka produced only about 48,000 metric tons of coconut oil, and the rest 23,000 metric tons of palm oil from 2 mills, as I mentioned, Wattawala and the AEA. The rest, the deficit of 229,000 metric tons is still being imported to this country at a tune of about 30 billion annual cash flow. So which is quite a significant amount. And in order to be self-sufficient and to produce the 229,000 in 2014, it was decided to plant 20,000 hectares. But unfortunately, we have not been able to plant it due to various reasons. If not, we could produce this amount in order to stop the import as an import substitution, I must say. Yeah. So basically the perception is that Sri Lankan, as I mentioned, in Indonesia, there is about 6.5 million hectares of land is planted with oil palm. Whereas if you really look at in the Sri Lankan context, the entire land what we have is 6.5 million hectares. So out of which actually that we have utilized about 2.6 million hectares is the agricultural land, and out of which only 10,000 is only 0.01% of the million hectares of the which is planted under oil palm, which is only about 0.38%. Yeah. So I think Dr. Rajadure spoke about the people's aspect and the aspirations of the people, and also how we take care of them. But when it comes to palm oil sector or the regional plantation companies, their income is almost 3 times of a rubber worker. And also that, as I mentioned, as a higher crop, and also average is about 45K, and it is much higher than the others. But there are some staff and the workers of us is drawing much higher salaries than this, and then that's mainly because of the income which generates from the palm oil. Then taking into consideration of the townships and the a development that what you see where the oil palm is grown is much higher than the other places where the plantation industry is in existence. So if you look at the livelihood of the employees in the palm oil sector or the industry, like we see most of them, all of them are they travel by bike, or they have 3-wheeler or any other business, and also that from small petty and things like that, we have seen the entire township development. Then also that we have lots of suppliers and others who have really directly or indirectly supporting the industry, and which by that they also develop themselves. And also that road and infrastructure within the states are much better, and then there is development. So moving on to the world scenario that palm oil is growing in extent in order to cater to the growing demand in oil. So which you can see from the slide, and then it is much more higher productive crop than any other oil producing crop. So it's basically in the world context, the future for palm oil is much brighter. I think in some other country, mainly in Indonesia and Malaysia, where they have gone through the hard times of extending that extent, and they have gone into a larger extent. So I think it's set now. So the production is going to be higher, and also that what we see is that the land productivity in terms of palm oil from 16 tons per hectare, now it's moving to about 30 tons per hectare. So from the land area that they will get more. But whereas in the Sri Lankan context, also we have the same principles, but we have a lot of limitations in moving forward in that direction. Though the demand for the Sri Lanka, the oil as well as the products which are produced by palm oil is in need. I would not be able to kind of highlight how we are going to look at that for the future. So thank you. I think I'm open for any questions on the kind of palm oil industry, and then kind of take it from there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Pannanwala, for that overview. Now, my first question to you is the most pressing question in the industry right now, the palm oil ban. So what is your view on the ban of new planting, and how would the industry work with the government and other industry stakeholders to address this? And I also want to know, now, would this affect the replanting programs once the existing palm oil near its maturity?
Yeah, definitely it will affect the kind of new planting programs, and also that currently we are going through a process of replanting, making use of the plants what is lying in the nursery to a tune of about 500 million, that we are unable to move it out from the nurseries to the actual land. So that has a huge impact. Apart from that, most of the companies have prepared the land in order to contribute, in order to replant it with oil palm. So that also has come to a halt. So there are two segments or three segments in these palm oil plantations. Mainly the first is that planting of oil palm, which I said, like, we started about 50 years ago. Some of those fields or extents have to be replanted. So that means that oil palm to oil palm also has stopped at the moment. Then apart from any kind of a diversification from any other crop, it can be rubber, it can be any other crop, also is not there. But I must say that as far as the kind of extents in terms of palm oil, the extents are not actually, we are not achieved anything closer to the 20,000 hectares, which we are around only about 50% of the approval which was granted to plant. So actually, currently that we are going through the kind of we are lobbying with the government to kind of look at it in a different angle, since it is contributing to the industry, contributing to Sri Lanka, and also that to mainly to stop the kind of to contribute towards the import substitution. So these are the things that which we have been taking up in the recent past.
Sure, sure. And also in Wattawala case, what's the mature land extent?
As far as the Wattawala, that has the highest extent in palm oil. So currently we have mature extent is 2,900, almost 3,000 hectares, and then the rest is about immature. But as far as the Wattawala concerned, that we have only a lesser amount of the kind of moving into the other kind of extending oil palm. It is only that mostly that what we have is mature areas have to be replanted in the years to come.
Right. So my next question is yet another pressing problem, and the wage hike proposal. So this is the first time actually that came as a budget proposal, perhaps, setting wrong precedents also. So I'd like to know from both of you, what is your stance on this, and has the industry agreed upon on a final figure? So I'd like to go first with Mr. Pannanwala, because he's the chairman, Plantation Services, the Employee Federation of Ceylon.
Yeah, actually, this is the first time that it has been announced through the budget proposal. It had never come before. But still, we are not exactly sure of what have been proposed, and the numbers are not being given, though it has been mentioned about 1,000 rupees wage, which we don't know what are the components that are going to come in. So we will kind of discuss with the government and see, what are the areas that we could put it in. and all that. In the meantime, we are coming to the end of the wage collective agreement by end January. So even otherwise that we have to negotiate to get into a new wage agreement with the unions. So this is where we are at the moment.
Dr. Rajature, if you also
Yes.
can weigh in.
I will wade into the controversy. I also feel that private sector wages should not be mandated by legislation. It should take into the factors controlling and inherent in the industry, and the market forces must play out their game, and both or any contending party must come to some sort of equilibrium where the industry can afford the wage that it wishes to pay. A classic case, I'm talking of the smallholder sector of Sri Lanka. I think I want to make a correction. Now, currently, they contribute to 76% of the total national green leaf production. While it's true that RPC is also taking some of their leaf and produce, but in terms of green leaf, they contribute to 76%. Now, they have very sustainable, very dynamic system where the producer is paid, the plucker, in terms of plucker is paid a rate in relation to the price that the factory achieves. Currently 68%, so it's converted to green leaf, but the picker is getting only 30 rupees per kilo, right? So even though the low country tea prices are always in the last 20 years or so about rupees 90 more than the high grown averages, so the picker himself or herself gets 30 rupees. Of course, we are aware 80% of the pickers are hired pickers, so they don't have any of the traditional and statutory facilities that we have, like EPF, ETF, 20 days sick pay and 20 days paid holiday, maternity benefits, a whole host of benefits. But that is what the business can afford, right? Because that's how it operates. The small holder proper gets 68% of the value, but he pays the picker 30 rupees currently maximum, because rest of the money he has to use it for upkeep and inputs. So that is on one side. 440,000 people are operating. It's very dynamic. Year on year, it's increasing the proportion and percentage. They have very, very good quality of life. Otherwise, 440,000 people won't be in business. They are keeping on expanding. In the RPC sector, we have agreed on a collective agreement or collective bargaining process, which we have been doing every 2 or 3 years. It's long drawn out. It's very contentious because a lot of other parties get involved. Parties who have no stake also get involved, and it's a sort of a I can't use the word, but it's a big spectacle because everybody wants to jump in and stir the pot and create a huge confusion. So over the years, I mean, if you look at the facts, during the state, the wages over the 10 years, it has gone up by a factor of four times. But from 1992 to 2019, we have increased it by 16 times. So clearly, after RPC management, the rise in wages have been very much faster, almost 4 times as fast as that of the government managed. So that's the point. So what we are telling is that we also like the workers to earn as not 1,000, even more. Currently, if you look at the RPC, I mean, pay slips or check rolls, most of the workers are earning 30, 35,000, the productive workers. Our issue is that wage should be linked to productivity, like in the smallholder sector and in any agriculture sector, because we can pay the employees, whether it's workers or not, only out of the revenue we get from the product. Now, in terms of tea, as it was in the past, even now, even the TRI, practically we have done regression analysis, 67% of the cost of production is labor related. So we can improve every other efficiency, but if the labor wage and the productivity is not in tangent, then of course our industry is not going to be sustainable. So that is why we are telling all the stakeholders, if you want to have a sustainable, viable industry that benefits the people involved in it, we need to move on to a system where higher productivity is rewarded. The current system precludes any productivity improvements because they get 300 days work. Even if they bring 12 to 13 kilos, we have to pay the full wages. So issue is the good pluckers. Even in our companies, they earn more than 35 to 40,000 rupees. Some are going up to 50,000 rupees average. So there is no question, no reluctance or anything on our part to give workers higher wages, but they have to earn it. That's our point. So we have very good systems where we have proposed uh, based on productivity, and we have proposed it to the stakeholders and to the government. Definitely the wages will be more than 1,000 rupees if they adopt that. But if we rely or if we stick to the 150-year-old traditional attendance-based wage, then our cost of production is always going to be higher than the revenue. Now, currently, for argument's sake, if we pay a total of 1,000 rupees to the workers per day, immediately our cost of production will rise up to 738. Okay, you can shave off 5 rupees, 10 rupees this way, that way. But current selling price today is 570 rupees. So how can we as a professional manager bridge such a big gap? 570 rupees is the value we get for a kilo of tea, but we are spending 730. This I'm only talking of tea. What about the rubber? So we have a practical issue. So I hope the parties concerned and the stakeholders understand the seriousness of the issue, because if we pay this, it's not even to cover the prime cost of just plucking and manufacturing. So it's as bad as that. Connected to this, I want to mention that now when we started the privatization, we had about 327,000 registered workers. For so many reasons, which we can quite very well understand. There's out migration from the plantation sector. And as my friend Binesh told that in the oil palm sector, there, I think his average earnings is 45 to 50,000 rupees. That is for productive workers. They are not paid on number of hours they just hang around the field. They are paid on their output. So we also want to migrate to a system where hard work, productivity is rewarded, and already we are doing it in all the 20 RPCs. It's happening. Otherwise, how do you think that we are getting almost the same crop, barring the variation dependent on weather? If we have drought or excessive rain, we have 5 million. We will go this way, that way. Otherwise, about 85 million to 90 million kilos of output, estate output is our tea production. With 327,000 people did. Now about 135,000 people are doing. So we have innovative methods. We have new systems. Our managers on the ground have been very smart, very innovative, getting the workers to work in a different model. And now what our request, our appeal is for all the stakeholders to look at it in a very practical, very pragmatic manner and support the workers to earn more. We also want to give as professional managers, if the workers are happy, less headaches and less problems, not only for us, for the politicians, for the government, because they have a contented population, contented workforce who will have a better quality of life. Actually, if you look at the numbers, I've just digressed. If you look at the poverty headcount figures, without looking at the plantation sector, Nuwara district has almost 65% of its population as plantation workers, and only regional plantation company employment is there. There are no small holdings. If you look at the real numbers, you can see all the quality of life denominators and the poverty headcount ratio, even better than some of the other areas. Only about 9 urban centered districts are better than the Nuwara poverty headcount. If you look at every telephone usage, TV, mobile phone, anything else, they're as good as any other sector of the country. So what we are saying is roll out this program, encourage people to be productivity-based wage rather than attendance-based, because it precludes any sort of a motivation to go for higher productivity. So this for the wage, this is what I have to say. We have taken this matter up with all the unions. We have taken with our line ministers and other stakeholders. I think they see the writing on the wall. If you go in this manner, there's nothing but diminution of the industry. And a classic example is, I'm not trying to identify a particular segment. You can look at the set of estates that were not privatized. With the privatization, adjoining estates, there were some areas, estate A was given under RPC, estate B on the boundary was not given. I'm not going to talk more than that. You have to look at the outputs, profitability, quality of life, earnings, and the number of days work in those estates. No fault of the management on the property, but because the system, what has happened. So had we not privatized, I think if you go by the losses that we made at that time, we will be incurring about 40 billion losses. So the government took the right decision in privatizing and keeping it sustainable and viable. But we have to take the next step of giving a long-lasting solution to this. Every 2 years we have this headache of negotiating for wages. So I think we should all sit around the table and give a solution that will be ongoing, that will be sustainable. And we have fantastic example. We don't have to experiment, we don't have to try out. We have our own people in Sri Lanka, tea smallholder sector, and some of our own companies, even today, doing this method. So our appeal to everybody connected and all the stakeholders at whatever level is to look at this whole issue in a pragmatic way. There is no contest. We are not saying we don't want to give, we don't like to give. No, we as professional managers love to give even more than this, but it has to be a business based solution, not a political based solution. So that's what I have to say. We have
Sure.
yes.
So how successful the lobbying has been? So do you think the government will listen to you this time?
I think so, because we have had, I think since everybody is aware at the general election, this promise was made about 1,000 rupees. And we also worked hand in hand with all the government ministers, even the Honorable Prime Minister and high government officials. We are given our proposals. It is our firm belief that when the Honorable Prime Minister mentioned this at the budget speech, we believe that he was referring to the proposals that we have given. He said proposal, and that he's going to implement the proposals that we have given, which I don't think the unions will object, or there's no logical reason for them to object, because the workers are going to earn 1,200, 1,300 rupees more, which they are doing now. We are given very attractive terms, far better than the smallholder sector is providing. And I think this is a golden opportunity for them to grab it and really fly from there onwards.
Sure, sure. But however, assuming the worst case scenario, if this proposal came into effect, what is the impact going to be for both Waterwell and Hayleys? If you can give like a figure.
For Hayleys group of our estates, it will be a 2.6 billion rupees hit in 1 year.
Okay.
Because other than the wage, we have a gratuity component. And we have noticed whenever the wage increases, then a lot of drawn gratuity people want to collect, withdraw money. So that is a huge amount that we really, as a professional manager, that we can afford. I'm sure Waterwell also has a significant impact. Our industry as a whole will take a death blow. So I don't think anyone in authority is going to do such an unwise thing as to kill the industry, because I have to mention here that while Sri Lanka tea is famous the world over, particularly high marks for the low-grown tea, because they have found a very good market. Our RPC estates, almost about 250 odd tea estates, we carry the almost 750 world-renowned required global certifications. So the Ceylon tea brand is based on this global certification in terms of very stringent Rainforest Alliance certifications, forest stewardship, a plethora of certifications, ethical tea partnership, mother and friendly child estates. So that's our leverage. Sri Lanka is ethical producer, sustainable producer, looking after and caring for its workforce. All those, mostly, I'm not saying it's exclusively, there are a few private factories who have these certifications, but predominantly the regional plantation company estates have these certifications. So any impact on the regional plantation sector, for which Ceylon tea is famous for, still in the world tea, they identify the high growth marks, will have a significant impact not only on us, it will have an impact on the whole tea sector, which includes almost 1 or 1.5 million people dependent on the smallholder sector.
Right. Maybe
I would like to add, Bani, I think if you look at the total for the industry, for all regional plantation companies, if the ballpark figure of whatever that you mentioned, that it comes about almost about 15 billion that will additional for a year. So that's going to be the impact for a year. So these on a turnover about 64 billion per year when you put all the regional plantation companies together. So that's quite a significant amount, which I think all the companies have to take. But as far as Waterwell is concerned, that our impact is around 200 million per year.
Okay. Okay. And my next question is to Mr. Pananbala. Now, the government proposed to intervene in plantation companies that have not made productive use of land. So how can we interpret this in the light of the management agreement between the government and the RPCs? And my secondary question to that is, what has the sector done for the government to come to such a decision, and what's the way forward?
Yeah, I think the decision, though this has been on card for a while, still exactly, I must say that, it has not been interpreted in such a way that the clarity is not there of what they mean by that. So we have to really kind of get it cleared properly what it means and things like that. So this has been on cards for a while. Even the previous government did a kind of a study on to see what are the regional plantation companies which does well and so forth. But in the other hand, as Dr. Rajadure mentioned, that most of the facts which have been kind of involved in regional plantation companies in terms of replanting, in terms of looking after the associates, the workers, etc. I think that have not been really still studied. This is my view. So I think it is basically going forward, probably as all regional plantation company will put it forward of what we have done, and these have to be really kind of looked at. So we have not been only in the tea segment, but we have been in the tea, rubber, oil palm, and also other crops where all these things have come to develop the land and to kind of make the land utilized better way to benefit all the stakeholders, including the workers. So this is my take on it. Yeah.
Sure. And now the palm oil industry, it's an industry protected by the government. And we've seen that there's an inverse relationship between the global palm oil prices and the protectionist tariff rates imposed by the government. So with palm oil price rising, do you see a reduction in the tariff enjoyed by the local palm oil industry?
Yeah, it's actually the special commodity levy is basically to protect the other coconut industry. It is mainly not for the palm oil industry. It's been protected. So the thing is to reduce the imports. So that is what the government is doing, and I can see that it is going to continue, because in order to kind of safeguard the coconut industry, it will continue. But as far as the kind of a global palm oil world palm oil price is concerned, what we see that it is on the increase, mainly because there's a huge shortfall in crop in the current year. It is not only a kind of a phenomenon in Sri Lanka, but it's all over the world. So if you look at the kind of going forward, a crop is going to be almost about 75% of the last 4 years.
Okay. And so my next question is to Dr. Rajadure. Now, a common complaint among the producers are, our labor cost is high. And now, especially if you look at since privatization, since 1992, now you said the labor cost has increased by 13-fold, despite a small increase in tea prices in dollar terms. So my question is now, doesn't this also speaks in volume that we are still a commodity exporter, and a lot has to be done in terms of going up in the value chain?
I think I have to agree with you completely. A lot of times when we take up this matter as to why the producer, be it the smallholder, in this case a regional plantation company, is not getting a price that at least covers the cost. The stock answer that we get is, why don't you all get into value addition? But I must qualify here, we producers, I'm particularly now talking of the regional plantation companies, we have a triple burden. Now we are responsible for that extent of land that you mentioned, and we are responsible for the soil, water, environmental, and the geographical conservation of that area. So that's why I said we have Rainforest Alliance, FSC certifications, and all the regional plantation companies who just go through have these certifications. So there's a mandatory requirement to conform to some environmental and geographical conservation practices. So we have that burden of looking after the physical environment that we operate in. Then we have the burden of looking after this 1 million resident population, from, in the planting parlance, we say from womb to the tomb. Health, sanitation, welfare, housing, the whole package, we look after them in our properties. Although only 135,000 contribute their labor, we look after a population of 1 million people. That is the geographical aspect, the soil, water, and the air, and the flora and fauna, then the human aspect, infrastructure. Then we have to also be responsible for the product, ISO, quality standards. So we look after all three things, and I think it's very unfair to expect us to get into the value chain because it's a very, very complicated and a very competitive business. So I don't think that we can be everything to everybody in the total value chain. Our role is fairly well defined in the value chain, and already we have very well established brands. We have established companies that are doing good global business in the trade. So I think I must pass the baton to them to add value and leverage our Ceylon tea in the global market so that the producer can get a better price at the auctions, that it can go down to the bottom levels of where our workers or associates are involved.
Sure, sure. And also another concern in the industry, the acute labor shortage.
Yes.
So now we've seen the labor force in the plantation sector coming down over the years, especially with the younger generation opting to work outside the tea estates. Now we've got a question from one of our participants also, a similar question. And also now, especially now, in your case now, Horana plantation now, that area is also very, industry oriented. So how do you see this? How do you, keep yourself above this?
Right. Thank you very much for that question. I think labor out migration from the farming sector, whether it's tea or rubber or paddy, is an irreversible process. Right. As the country moves away from agriculture-based economy, going into service or industry or in other sectors, it is a natural phenomena which we cannot stop, and we don't want to stop it. Going back, even people are talking of out-migration after privatization. If you take the immediate 10 years preceding privatization, about 215,000 workers have moved out from the plantation industry. Because in Sri Lanka, it's perceived that planting is not a dignified job. It's a perception. Although their earning capacity is there, and with better access to education, transport, communication, and the, how shall I say, the industry and the economy is developing at various fronts. So people have access to better jobs, and like everybody, they have much better aspirations than being an agricultural worker, particularly in the plantation sector, given the historical legacies and other tags associated with that. That we are fully aware, and we are not, how shall I say, compelling people to remain in the plantation as plantation workers, because a dignity issue, as Binesh discussed. Almost 45,000-50,000 they earn. That's in itself, because they have basically no other expenditure. And even in the tea sector, there are women who are earning 35,000-40,000 regularly, a large percentage. So it's a matter of dignity to workers. So that is why at the outset I said we are proposing a model where the workers can be their own masters. Like in the smallholder sector, they are their own masters. They manage themselves. So that is where the future of the industry needs to be. But in terms of retaining the workers, particularly we notice that the younger generation, particularly boys, they like to move out to towns, and we see them really roughing out, having a hard time in Colombo, but during the festivals and other times they come to the estate dressed very well. So it's a matter of dignity and social recognition and upward mobility. It's quite natural. For females, again, we see they have better access to education. When they study up to grade 10, then they don't want to be tea pickers. They come to Colombo mainly in supermarkets and shops. They do work. And at the time of marrying, say 2023, we have a reverse migration back to the estate, because the facilities and services provided by the estate. We have total maternal care, total custodial care of children till 5 years. So those benefits attract people to come back, and their kith and kin and social and community network is on the estates. So we have this kind of dilemma. People move out and they come back, and it has a significant impact on the industry because of productivity and skill. So we have done a lot of training, skill development, value orientation, and a lot of innovations have taken place in terms of the dignity, in terms of their personal protection in uniforms, so many skill development, recognition, training. Hundreds and hundreds of initiatives have taken place, at least to retain the people whom we have. So as I told you, we fully realize it's an irreversible process, not only in plantations. You go to a paddy farming sector, paddy farmer doesn't want his son or daughter to be a paddy farmer. They have access to education and they want a better life. So we have a challenge. And apart from that, as I told you, the dignity impact, then their cultural and historical legacy of being from the plantation sector, all those have an impact on the out-migration. It's not only the work, and government and other stakeholders are now involved in the process of, instead of having these row houses, every house that we built for them, 1.2 million worth house, completely free in about 7 purchase land with all the amenities. It's like a village. It's not a row houses, it's village setting. So there are a lot of changes that are taking place in the plantation sector in terms of their health, in terms of the education, in terms of their housing and the facilities, that which we hope will attract workers back into the plantation sector. But again and again, the million-dollar question is, what is the model of employment? If they are going to be daily wage-based workers, I don't think we can pull them in. But if we say you be a smallholder, be your own block manager, manage your own affairs, because they don't like to be supervised by a Kangani in the state system, who has a less education level. People have dignity issues, so they like to work on their own without restrictive management. And that's the way to go. That's the way that we need to look at the future of the plantation youth. And we can
Thank
see,
you, Dr. Raz.
just to finish, we noticed that because of this COVID thing, we see a lot of young people coming and they go and work in the fields and they pluck 30, 40 kilos now. But they are not under our supervision. We have this outgrow or block plucking or revolution model. So they are happy. We are happy. Everybody wins in this manner.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajadura. So we have a series of questions to Mr. Pananwala from our audience. So first one, who are the biggest buyers of palm oil in the country? And can you give us a breakdown of palm oil in terms of usage? Who are the biggest buyers and the usage?
Yeah, actually the palm oil, as I mentioned, mainly that we do import palm oil. So, which is about 220,000 metric tons per year to a tune of about 30 billion. So these are mainly imported by about 3-4 kind of importers. It's about 3, and then there are about 14 millers who import this palm oil in the form of refined or what you call as crude palm oil. So if you look at the Sri Lankan context, again, there are about 3 buyers who kind of purchase palm oil from our mill because we don't do the refining part, but we do produce only the crude palm oil and palm kernel oil. So the major players are as you say, Pyramid Wilmar, NMK and things like that. So I don't want to mention the names, but 3 bigger players and about rest of them are small players.
And in terms of usage, which industries are these mostly?
So basically, palm oil is in all the industries. So if you look at the kind of a biscuit, if you look at the kind of a detergents, you get everything has palm oil. So it's very vast category of products which come from palm oil. But if you look at the kind of, I think the retail business of the real retail oil business is very small. But what is going in mostly is the commercial industries to kind of produce on the value addition side.
Sure. And so there's another question. People have a false fear that oil palm depletes water resources and water levels. How would you address this specific concern scientifically?
Yeah, so this is a huge concern, which is mainly in Sri Lanka, which is not so much in where the countries produce large volumes of palm oil, which is Indonesia, Malaysia, accounts for 13.5 million hectares of land. And also that mainly the palm oil is grown in the areas where there is a kind of even rainfall throughout the year. Palm oil doesn't grow in the kind of a dry areas or kind of a dry zone where a lot of people think that it can be grown. So in terms of, if you look at the kind of areas where the palm oil is grown, you see a kind of a rainfall pattern of almost about 4,000 millimeters of rainfall per year, right? So because of that reason, I think it's a myth that we just setting. So also the other factor is that most important factor is for palm oil, you need per hectare or a unit area, it's only about 125 palms. Whereas if you look at for rubber, that you need to have 550, then for tea, if you require about 13,500. But if you per unit area, the absorption or the water intake is almost the same. So it is not it is more of a myth that people think that the palm oil dries up the area and all that, which is not seen, which is very evident when you see in those areas. And also that in the Sri Lankan context, that we don't have large contiguous blocks of land for oil palm, like which you see like 20,000, 30,000 hectares of land, monocrop in other countries, which we don't see it here. If you look at the area where we cultivate, our land blocks are quite small, like maybe a kind of a same field size of a rubber field or a tea field or something like that. And in between you get villages, you get kind of a paddy fields, other kind of what you call crops coming in. So it's more of a multi-crop. It's not a contiguous and kind of a monocrop that can be classified in Sri Lankan context. So this is actually that we have been putting it out. We have been kind of trying to deal with the kind of a village and then do in terms of village integration programs. We have educated as much as possible, which I think people who have been with the palm oil, oil palm industry for the last 50 years, especially the areas where we are in, they know what it is. So it's only the new area where it had gone in only that this matter is being kind of pursued.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming through our chat window, and also given that we have only like 15 minutes to go, so we'll try to accommodate all of that. Maybe we'll try to give probably brief answers. So, so there's another question. Will there be foreign ownership? Will there be foreign ownership in RPC companies going forward? And I also like to know, do you see a possibility of the golden shareholder selling out?
According to the law, as you understand, maximum foreign ownership is 49%. It's restricted to that. So I don't think there can be foreign control in RPCs.
Okay. And golden shareholder?
Golden shareholder is represented by the Secretary to the Treasury now. He has only like a nominal one share. And sometimes the government still holds some of the shares because RPCs bought 51% of the shares. Then it was mandatory to give 10% of the shares to the employees free. So balance shares were traded at the stock exchange, and some of the shares that the government held, which they didn't dispose, they have it. So it's up to the government to do what is best with the shares that they hold.
Sure, sure. And also in terms of use of new technology, there are a couple of questions. So let me find them. Okay, so there's one question. So if certain estate face shortages of workers, couldn't we use drones with sensors to pick tea leaves into a collection inflatable bag? Now, China transfers tea leaves by drones. And here in Sri Lanka, we use drones only for spraying fertilizers only.
Can I answer that, Binesh? Actually, even for spraying fertilizers, Helis plantations we started, but with the Easter bombing, then that program has to stop. It's not practical. It's nice to do in a small block, but in commercial scale operations, because of the lie of the land and because of shade trees and other impediments in the lie of the land, it has not been tried out anywhere in the world. Picking tree by drones. We certainly use selective and seasonal mechanical devices for plucking, harvesting. But to my knowledge, I don't know where these drones are used for commercial scale plant harvesting anywhere in the world.
Okay, and also there's a question that there's a lot of opportunity for diversification with the import protection available. So what have you done in your companies to exploit these opportunities? Let's make it like a rapid fire session, quick answers.
First of me first. Quickly then I start. We have gone in for agar, cinnamon, turmeric, and other sort of food crops during this short time. But long term, we are diverted as they have done oil palm, cinnamon, and other export, coconut particularly, other export agriculture crops.
So actually, we have gone for most of the, one is the perennial crops and also that short rotation crops as well, taking into the advantage of the current situation. So where the land is available, I think lots of RPCs have gone even for vegetables. So these been there, and also that through the PHDT that we have initiated, and the RPCs have agreed to provide land for the kind of for the youth who have come to the estates during this COVID situation, for them to grow vegetables and to have what you call commune farming. So these have been kind of encouraged.
Right, thank you. So Dr. Rajadure, the current pickup in demand, so how sustainable do you think it is? And maybe what's your outlook, say, for the next year?
I think we can safely say that at least for the next 2 quarters, we'll have a good demand for tea. Only dark cloud in that silver lining is that this year, because of bad weather at the first quarter, we have lost about 25% of our national tea crop, and our pieces also reflect that trend. And that is one of the reasons why the prices have improved, because of the shortage of tea. But nevertheless, we are grateful to the increased prices, which is helping us. And we hope that we are quite confident that this trend will continue in the next 2 quarters.
Thank you. And Mr. Pannanvala, is labor importation a possible solution for the labor shortage?
I don't think it's a kind of a possible solution at the moment. It is, we can work on it, but the thing is that at the moment, with the kind of automation and also that mechanization, all regional plantation companies are managing well. And also the other thing, which one factor is that, like, if you look at the land utilization, that's why in most of the parts, the oil palm cultivations are coming in. Because where we had excess workers, now we don't have any more excess workers. So we are managing with the workforce that we have, especially in kind of wherever the areas where we have gone in for oil palm.
Okay. So in terms of increasing the float, are you looking at ways to increase the liquidity of the share?
Not at the moment. We'll have to take a call later.
Okay. Dr. Rajadure?
Yes, I think that we'll leave it to our boards to decide. We are quite well at the moment, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Pannanvala, there's a question on the dairy sector also. Is it okay if I take it?
Yeah.
Okay. So how would the company try to capitalize on the dairy farming benefits given by the government in the new budget? And how would the financing be done?
Yeah, so the thing is that, again, this is a matter which has been discussed by the government mainly to promote dairy farming in the regional plantation companies. So already there have been a couple of meetings to encourage the regional plantation companies to go for the dairy industry. And some have already agreed, some have not. So their main target is to increase the large farm production. So currently the large farm, there are only about 2 or 3 farms, which produce only about 5% of the Sri Lankan the total consumption. So the rest is coming from where you have the small farmers, where they have about 5 to 10 animals and less than 1 to 5 animals, which produce about almost 95% of the Sri Lankan milk production. So because of that, the government is promoting in it through two prong. One is that to encourage the genetic herd of the kind of a current herds that we have. The second thing is that mainly the fact is that the feed has to be kind of improved, because the thing is, once you get down the hybrid animal where we have failed in the past, is mainly because of the non-availability of feed, and the cost of feed is much higher than other parts of the world, and we don't have nutritious feed. Which can be kind of in other countries, even us, we have been importing from countries like Argentina and Spain to kind of sustain the feed requirement. So these areas have been, the government is promoting, and also that I think that's one of the bigger areas that the government is promoting, mainly to be self-sufficient in milk production in the country.
Okay. So Dr. Rajadure, 2 questions on the rubber industry. So first, with rising demand for PPE, demand for rubber too has increased. Is the current production adequate to meet demand? That is question number 1. And how sustainable are the current price levels? And what's the outlook?
Actually, as for rubber, we must step back. Before the COVID, rubber prices were so dismally low that a lot of smallholders, that's about 70% of our production is again smallholders, smallholder rubber, they went out of rubber production because in about 2011, we got almost 450 rupees for RSS, and which has come down to about 250 rupees by 2019. So as a result, a lot of people went away from rubber, and suddenly the COVID situation came upon us. And because of our low productivity in Sri Lanka, it is cheaper to import rubber from Indonesia and Thailand and Vietnam. So one thing is most of our rubber produced locally is value added in the country. So that's a positive sign. And rubber prices have just improved a little because of the peculiar situation, because of the logistics in shipping. So we hope that there will be far more demand for personal protection, which is good for the rubber sector. And we are hopeful that this trend at least will continue, that will induce people to come back for rubber. So in terms of rubber production, I can't see it increasing radically because about 7 or 8 years back, we produced 150 million kilos of rubber, which has come down to about 75 million kilos, merely because, as I mentioned, smallholders went away from rubber because it was not profitable. RPCs, as I mentioned earlier, we are mandated to give 300 days work. So we have to keep the rubber estates going, whether it's profit or loss. So there's a little bit of a normalcy coming into the rubber sector. And if the prices are good, more and more people will come back to tap in the rubber, which is untapped.
Sure, sure. And the second question is, currently rubber output is mostly sold off auctions. So how does this affect price transparency, and what can be done about it?
Actually, large quantities are sold at the rubber auctions. Rubber is again a smallholder crop, and they sell the rubber as RSS in these bazaars and small townships. And there's another supply chain of people who collect it. So the non-auction rubber also keeps an eye on the Colombo rubber auction price, and there is some sort of a correlation to price in the rubber growing areas, in the bazaars and towns and rubber dealers. So for the moment, it's working without a hitch. But eventually, the rubber prices of the auctions must improve for the smallholder to get the benefit of that.
Sure, sure. And maybe I'd like to hear from both of you. So the COVID second wave impact, how has it impacted the industry?
Actually, before Binesh helps me there, we were one industry in Sri Lanka within 3 days. Only with 3 days we stopped in March. We quickly got back to normalcy in our operations in growing and manufacturing and transporting and shipping and packing up to the ship with the help of all the stakeholders involved, from the state, from the health, from the law enforcement, plantations, buyers, brokers, the statutory bodies, everybody. So right now, that's history. We were very fortunate up to about November. We didn't have a single case among 1 million population of COVID, but with this latest outbreak, we have isolated cases, not of our own people, but people who come from this and other sectors. Sooner we have a protocol in this, no sooner they come, they are tested and necessary protocols, reporting the health. We don't have an outbreak. The situation is under control. Safety and protocols. Binesh, you can add. I think,
yeah. So I think as Dr. Rajendra mentioned, like the RPC's concern had immensely contributed to the kind of health authorities to maintain that level, because the thing that we have the infrastructure in different levels. The RPCs, like if you look at it, like our staff, 33% of our staff are in medical and welfare staff who are working on our estates. So we have the infrastructure to look at it when someone comes from Colombo, or to report it and things like that, which I think a lot of kind of information have been provided to health authorities. So that's why up to the Deepavali or up to the end of November, that we didn't have a single case on our estates. So that's one thing. And also the other one is that as far as the production concerned, we have managed to get it going from the first 2-3 days, like across all the tea, rubber, as well as the oil palm. So even our mills have been running, so we have not had a problem. Then also that the government authorities also are very helpful to get it going in that direction, because the thing is, all our associates are daily wage. The moment that there is no kind of a movement of the production going out from our factories, etc., what happened is that basically that we had to stop work. Then as a result, the associates would have lost their wages, so which are not the case in the RPC. So that are well managed, I would say.
Sure, sure. And now, since we have a few more questions, maybe we'll take about another additional 10 minutes.
Yeah, no issue.
So this is Dr. Rajadure. This is for you. Now, what measures has the industry taken to promote Ceylon tea overseas? And also about the cess, the 350 rupee per kilo of export sales. Now, can this be used to promote the industry?
Actually, the cess is used primarily for the TRI and associated agencies for research purposes. We have a promotion fund contributed by the industry that we aim to use for promotion of Ceylon tea. So unfortunately, this COVID pandemic interrupted the launching of it, but very soon it will take place, and I'm sure that we will get gainful results from that. I also must mention Ceylon tea still maintains the sort of that brand name of cleaners, best quality, because in all the auctions from about 2000 for the last 20 years, we get the highest average price in Colombo. So that means that our tea is the best in the world, mainly because of our climate and terrain and topography and our stock. And at one point, it's a disadvantage to have a small land, but at another area, we have used it to advantage in producing teas different to the other, not mass scale, niche teas. And that is why we are getting the premium price. And I'm sure our market and brand people who have brands are doing the job in promoting Ceylon tea. And that is another reason that we get a pull for high price at the auctions. But we can certainly improve. We can certainly improve the Colombo auction prices. Because there was a study done in the UK, not in a study by Vaughan Ward, which showed that retailers in the supermarket shelves and blenders have the highest profit, almost 45%, while the producers have only 1%. So the problem is at the other end. There's a lot of demands in terms of certifications and conformances, but the producer also must get the gain or benefit of that effort. That's what I have to say.
Okay. Okay, and there's another question. Now, this is about the competition. Is it true that producer countries must adhere to ISO 3720 in respect of teas offered at the auction? Then why is Kenya offering refuse tea for sale at the Mombasa public tea auction, and they've been doing this for some time?
Well, it's all having to do with the markets. In Sri Lanka, we export 95% of our tea, and we have a reputation for quality and ethical and sustainable production. 3720 is the most basic. It's like it's taken for granted because we have to have certifications like mother and child friendly plantations, ethical tea partnership, rainforest alliance, forest stewardship certificate, fair trade. So there are other certifications that are far more demanding, more stringent, more complicated than 3720. That's only operational certification. And RPCs and some of the private tea factories have got these certifications. They are inspected, audited by foreign auditors. So it's very stringent, very difficult. And so far, I would say that Ceylon tea has maintained its supremacy in terms of ethical practices, sustainability, and quality, manifested by the fact that we still, even for the last 20 years, get the highest price at the Colombo auctions, which is about $50 more than the other auctions in the world.
Right.
So
right.
Kenya is selling refuse tea because they have a different market, because in Africa per capita income is very low, and there is a market that what we call refuse is not refuse, it's a misnomer, it's a byproduct, not at the highest quality. So that is up to their consumers and what they can afford.
Okay. Okay. So in terms of new market, so has there been a shift in buyer market for Sri Lankan tea, maybe especially towards China? And also, what particular category of tea that they're interested in? What's the current contribution from such new markets to export volumes?
Actually, 70% of our tea is absorbed by the Russian, CIS countries, formerly CIS countries, and the Middle East. And any change in the economy related to the oil prices will have a direct impact on us. So for the moment, although with all the social, economic, and political upheavals taking place in the Middle East, that market is reasonably stable. But China is the new kid on the block because they produce green tea. It's a fashion to have now black tea. Just as much as a lot of Sri Lankans are drinking green tea, health benefits are almost the same. There's nothing different in it. So China is an emerging market, and we believe that Africa is an emerging market, and parts of Southeast Asia where per capita income and the prosperity levels are improving, we can leverage and position ourselves in those markets quite aggressively, far more than the African countries can do.
Right. And our next question is on rubber. So rubber and tea, replanting. So what is the requirement under the management agreement with the government? Like how often should it be done as per the management agreement? And how is it being actually done?
There is, whether it's not management, agriculturally cloned, vegetatively propagated tea will last. Its economic life would be about 50 years. With good management and agriculture practice, you can stretch it for another 10 years. So as a business, if the lifetime is 50 years, then you have to replant 2% every year. Like the rubber, the lifespan is 30 years, and every year we replant 3%. In the good years, we replanted 6 to 7%. So that's how, although our rubber extent is 40,000 hectares, we have already replanted 70,000 hectares. That means some of the old rubber we inherited, we took out, and double the rate we replanted. In terms of tea, there is no reluctance on our part to replant because already we have 56% of VP. The issue is we cannot harvest the existing VPT to the optimum. Theoretically and in practice, we need to harvest about 4 to 4.5 rounds in a month. But we don't have sufficient workers to harvest it even 3 times. So that is why we have to resort to block plucking, revolution, and other methods. So if we can have a sustainable wage model, like in the smallholder sector, I'm sure all the regional plantation companies will concentrate more on replanting because the output and productivity will be different to that of the current model. So that is the brief answer, because it takes, according to the TRI calculations, more than 30 years in the current rate to recover the investment. And our lease period is only another 22. So there are a lot of other, how shall I say, contending reasons. And I, of course, as a practitioner, believe that we have, for the moment, sufficient VP if we harvest it to the optimum level. We are unable to harvest what we are having. So what is the justification in planting new VP just to abandon VP that we have planted at a great cost, almost 1.5 billion rupees per hectare now, cost of replanting.
Okay. So in terms of certification, so there's a question that do certification translate to higher prices? And if so, maybe what's the premium?
Unfortunately, this debate has been going on for some time. We are telling the buyers and the international blenders, look, we carry all the burden, as I mentioned earlier, land, people, and the product. But where is the gain in certifications for the producer? So we are of the strong opinion that the gain that the blenders and packers and retailers get in putting a certified and certified product, part of that gain must come to the producer. Then only it's sustainable. So we believe that we need a higher share of the gain of that certification process.
Okay, so we'll take the last 2 questions, Mr. Pannanwala. So now the climate change, it's having a big impact on the industry. With the predictability of the weather patterns is almost it's not there. So what has the industry done, or what is the industry intend to do to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, so the climate actually, it has, like, if you really look at the kind of in the Sri Lankan context, in the areas where we have done planting, it's like, it is true that the what you call the weather pattern has changed, but the climatic conditions have not changed to a greater deal. Especially like if you look at in the areas where you have the kind of oil palm, which is a kind of a bird which has been used in terms of environment and things like that. Like when you relate it to the rainfall, actually we see a kind of a higher rainfall during the last few years. So in terms of the mitigation, the RPCs have done is that we have gone into forestry, then also through these systems which is coming in, especially like, in the sector of kind of oil palm, we see that like, we have just gone in for RSPO certification. So with the RSPO certificate, we have to preserve certain land areas, even what is inside the kind of a oil palm planted area, we have to reserve certain areas as mini jungles, etc. So these are some of the things that which we have done to kind of mitigate this climate change. And apart from that, more than before that, we have got all the data for the last 100 years. And also that we, going forward, that we have tools to kind of identify what is it going to be, especially kind of looking at the weather patterns and things like that. So apart from that, I think all regional plantation companies have undertaken agri practices, the best good agricultural practices in terms of looking at the kind of looking at the climate change, looking at the other repercussions with regard to the erosion, etc. So these are all will have a good impact towards the climate, and also that kind of the contribution from the RPCs are much greater than some of the other sectors.
Right. So the final question is to Dr. Rajadure. So I want to know your thoughts on these adulterated practices, because now just a few months ago we saw the president made an appeal to the tea factory owners not to tarnish the reputation of the Ceylon tea by mixing molasses and sugar. So what is your take on this, and how bad is the situation, and what has the industry done together with the government to address the situation?
Actually, absolutely, there is no contention or debate about the disadvantage of even a small, minute percentage doing this kind of unethical, illegal adulterations, because when the word goes round, people lose faith and credibility in our brand. So I think the government has quickly acted on it and even gone up to the level of the HE to bring this matter. And I think that is reasonably well managed now. And we as practitioners or people involved in the industry are always educating and dissuading others resorting to this. There's no question that it is very, very harmful, not only to the industry, but as you mentioned, almost 10% of the population who are dependent on the tea industry alone. So I think that alone is sufficient to discourage or prevent any person from meddling with it's not only a product, it's a lifestyle. 1 million people are dependent on the tea industry in the plantations. Almost 1.5 million 5 million people are dependent directly on the plantation economy tea, apart from the bazaars and communities. So I think whoever is doing this, I'm sure, should come to the realization that it's not a trifle matter, it's a very serious matter, and the government has taken adequate steps. Just quickly adding to what Binesh said, I don't know how many listeners are aware that plantation companies in Sri Lanka have won global and Asian awards for sustainability. So that's to tie up with what we have done with the climate change effects and mitigations. Even at national level, plantation companies have beaten large companies and large multinational corporations in winning awards in terms of sustainability, in terms of environment protection, in terms of green agriculture. A lot of those areas which I'm sure a lot of people don't know. Even recently, 2 of the RPC companies reports were highlighted at the Nobel Institute for their sustainability efforts. So a lot of work is being done. Unfortunately, we don't blow our trumpet as much as we ought to or should do. So a lot of these things are done at ground levels, and we try our best to maintain the industry, its ecosystem, and the environment in which you are working to the benefit of our country, because we are consciously aware that the regional plantations control a lot of watersheds and very important ecosystems in our country, and whatever we do, their effects. As a result, they have undertaken a lot of conservation methods, greening of the hill country. This is not the place to talk about it, but just to give the assurance, we are conscious, our managers are conscious. Rainforest Alliance is a very tough certification. Having got that means that we are doing something right. So give that assurance to listeners that we are doing consciously to protect our environment and to minimize the effects of adverse climate change.
Right of today's session. And on behalf of Barclays Trilliga Securities, I'd like to thank Dr. Rajadure and Mr. Pannonvala for taking out time from your busy schedule, because you're very busy. I know Mr. Pananwali is actually, he has gone outstation also today. And thank you so much for joining and sharing valuable industry insights and knowledge with our clients. And also I'd like to thank all our listeners, our BRS clients, for joining. And we hope you found it useful. And thank you for your questions. I think we tried to get them answered as much as possible. And we'd like to know your feedback and how we can improve ourselves in future events. So talking about future event, so there's another webinar happening next week, next Wednesday, same time. So that will be about the NBFI sector, non-bank finance sector. So we hope to see you there too. And you can contact your investment advisor to get your login links. So again, thank you very much, everyone. So we are concluding the webinar now, and have a nice evening.
Thank you and good night to everyone.